that looms from a reckless, corrupt, arrogant, and unaccountable United States Supreme Court. During Chief Justice Roberts' tenure as Chief Justice, SCOTUS has been deconstructing democracy for all by rolling back civil rights, voting rights, and other civil liberties, while imposing on us their draconian nostalgia for an American democracy where the only people with power are white male Christian property owners. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for taking time from their busy schedules to be with us today for this important discussion. With us today, I'd like to introduce you to Cynthia W. Roseberry of the ACLU. She is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs, Justice at the National ACLU. She works to reform the criminal justice system, focusing on issues like policing, bail reform, clemency, the death penalty, and other criminal justice-related matters. And she also has served as the Executive Director of the Federal Defenders of the Middle District of Georgia. She's a founding board member of the Georgia Innocence Project. And I present to you Cynthia Roseberry. Next to her, Mr. Elie Mystal. Elie is the nation's justice correspondent and the host of its legal podcast, Contempt of Court. He's also an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center. His first book is the New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, published by the New Press. Elie can be followed at Elie NYC, Elie Mystal. Ms. Madiba Denny is an attorney, columnist, and professor whose work focuses on fostering an equitable, multiracial democracy. Her debut book, The Originalism Trap, How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We, the People, Can Take It Back, is now available wherever books are sold. Madiba is the deputy editor and senior contributor at the critical legal commentary outlet Balls and Strikes. In her previous role as a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, she provided legal and policy analysis regarding a range of democracy issues, including the census, the courts, and attempts to disempower communities of color. I present to you Madiba Denny.
You can get Madiba's book wherever books are sold unless you live in Florida.
Oh, yeah. And last but not least, Mr. Donald K. Sherman, who serves as Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington's Executive Vice President and Chief Counsel. Donald has held various oversight, ethics, and policy roles in the executive branch and Congress, including the White House, the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, the House Ethics Committee, and the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. He served as Chief Oversight Counsel to the late Elijah Cummings on the House Oversight Committee and as a Special Assistant to the President for Racial and Economic Justice in the Biden-Harris White House. I present to you Mr. Donald K. Sherman. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court has become too powerful and has thrown off kilter the delicate system of checks and balances that undergirds our democracy. We now have an activist Supreme Court motivated by political ideology and consumed by power and politics. Because of congressional malfeasance, SCOTUS has proceeded to warp democracy by corroding legislative power while bestowing monarchical power upon past and future presidents, including Donald Trump, or most pointedly Donald Trump. While untethering itself from the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, this Supreme Court has assigned unchecked power unto itself while degrading or delegating undue power and influence to wealthy corporations and high net worth conservative individuals. Profound observations previously uttered by other Supreme Courts, such as no person is above the law, now apply to everyone except for the justices themselves. Unelected and with lifetime tenure, these justices have been free to operate without being bound to a code of conduct like other judges. And whereas judicial rules of conduct prohibit lower court judges from accepting gratuities like free travel to extravagant vacation destinations, travel on private jets and opulent yachts, gifts including luxury motorhomes, etc., current Supreme Court justices have made the acceptance of such perks a routine practice. The long-held maxim that no man can be the judge and jury over their own conduct is routinely ignored by Supreme Court justices who arrogantly refuse to recuse themselves from cases where their or their wives' misconduct has created an obvious appearance of bias and prejudice for or against a party with a case before the court. Alarmingly, this court has become the best court that money can buy. Congress is responsible for allowing the court to become the threat that it is today, and it's Congress that has the responsibility of passing reforms that will diffuse this threat so as to protect and preserve the foundational concept of democracy, not just for the few, but for all. I'm looking forward to a conversation with this dynamic group of panelists today to talk more about what this problem looks like, how we got here, and what we can do to fix it. So we all know that the Supreme Court has the lowest public approval rating of any court in the history of the nation since these statistics were have been kept. And when the public loses confidence in the Supreme Court, it loses confidence in the rule of law. And when we lose confidence in the rule of law, say goodbye to democracy. That's where we are today. And I'd like to ask our panelists, how did we get to this point? Starting with Elie Mystal.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And just before I give my answer, I just want everybody to know and give a shout out to Congressman Johnson and his leadership on these issues. A lot of you guys don't know, but Congressman Johnson has cared about Supreme Court reform and ethics reform since before it was cool, all right? For the longest amount of time, Congressman Johnson and Senator Whitehouse were the only people in government you could get to come to a talk, to come to a panel, to care about the administration of justice in this country through the Supreme Court. So shout out to you for your leadership. It has been critical. And I will note this room is a lot bigger than when we started these panels because it seems like more and more people are realizing that the third branch of government must be brought to heel. And that is how I start to answer Congressman Johnson's question about how do we got here. We got here because for too long, the elected branches of government, Congress and the President, have abdicated their responsibility to regulate the Supreme Court. Understand this, in the Constitution, Article 3 of the Constitution, which sets up the Supreme Court, it is like 3 paragraphs. It is short. You could read it on your way to coffee, okay? And one of the only things the Constitution says is that there should be a Supreme Court and that the Supreme Court justices serve while in good behavior. Everything else, from their pay to their robes to where they hold their sessions, is regulated by Congress, but Congress has not regulated them with any seriousness for well over 100 years. So we are here in part because of an abdication of responsibility, but we're also here because the conservatives realized long ago, about 40, 50 years ago, that their policies were horribly unpopular. Just horribly unpopular. They could not win at the ballot box their ungenerous authoritarian policies in front of the American people. And they understood that the Supreme Court which is protected from the will of the American people, removed from electoral accountability. They realized that the Supreme Court was their best way to institute permanent one-party white minority rule upon the rest of us. And that has been their project for more than a generation, to create a Supreme Court that will do for Republicans that which they cannot win in front of the American people. And that is why we are here, because that project, that 50-year-old project, has succeeded.
Mr. Sherman.
So I agree wholeheartedly with Ellie's perspective about how we got here. And it has been an abdication of responsibility over a course of not just years, but decades. There have been ethics scandals at the Supreme Court before, but one of the differences was that when there were scandals, Congress actually gave a damn and did something about it. When Justice Abe Fortas was being considered for promotion to Chief Justice, it was revealed through that process that he had taken, I think, $15,000 from one entity and then $20,000 from a private foundation that had been embroiled in some kind of scandal. So that's $35,000 of payments in an environment where there wasn't a rule prohibiting him receiving those payments, led to political pressure that led for him not just to not become Chief Justice, but to step down from the court. We are now in an era, a half century later, where Clarence Thomas has taken one trip funded by one person that is upwards in the cost of $500,000 for one trip. And Congress blushes, right, at the idea of any sort of accountability, any sort of investigation. And again, I would credit Congressman Johnson for being one of the few members that has cared enough to move the needle on these issues, even when the public wasn't aware of the level of corruption and scandal that that some justices on the Supreme Court had engaged in. And thanks to really intrepid reporting from ProPublica, from the Wall Street Journal of all places, like, we have begun to fully understand what's happening in the federal judiciary, what's happening at the United States Supreme Court. I mean, of course, the gross irony of the situation is that this body of 9 individuals who are unelected and have more power, more unchecked power than any other government officials, right, in our government. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that borne out, especially over this term. They have more power than practically anyone in our government, and they have the by far of any government employees in our government. They have lower standards than the executive branch, lower standards than members of Congress. They have lower standards than other federal judges at the lower courts. And they have life tenure. And so, I think we are now beginning to understand the confluence, right, of how the corruption by some of these justices, as a result of the lax rules that we have in place for them, is impacting real people on issues that are affecting their pocketbooks, whether, or their bodily autonomy, right? Whether we get clean air and access to clean water, and what the federal government can do to prevent polluters, for example. We are finally sort of seeing that sort of toxic storm, right, like, come to pass at the same time. But again, credit to Congressman Johnson for really being a leader in putting these pieces together so that we could have some transparency. And now we need Congress to, I don't know, dust itself off, pick itself up, and I don't know, stick his chest out a little bit, right? And assert itself over a court that is run amok.
Thank you. Esteemed colleague from the great state of Virginia, Mr. Bobby Scott, who will become chair of the Education and Labor Committee once Democrats retake the House in November. So thank you for coming, Bobby. Next, I'd like to get the response of Ms. Rosenberry. Ms. Roseberry.
Thank you, Congressman Johnson. I'd agree and add that, first of all, let me say the opinions I express here are my own and not those of my employer. But I'll add that there's really been a 30-year plan to create a pipeline of law students and district judges within the federal system by a certain group of ideologues, right? And their views aren't shaped by representation of vulnerable individuals or marginalized communities like those the ACLU represents. But their plan really came into full public view and to the attention of most, of course, not you, Congressman Johnson, but to the attention of most when we saw former President Barack Obama unable to have his nominees even get a hearing, which stymied his ability, right, to get judges appointed. And so this was, what we saw as an upset of checks and balances, as it were, in most recent history. And I think about, during the Civil Rights era, Thurgood Marshall challenged, right, the status quo and got confirmed resoundingly 69-11. And you think about that up against Justice Ketanji Jackson, how we saw her treated during her confirmation hearing, such that a senator, right, had to come to, not to her aid because she was holding her own, let me just say that, but had to call that out. So I just say that to say that this is not a new game. Maybe there are some people who are just paying attention to it. This is a long-term plan that's been in place for a while, and we're now beginning to see the results of it. They are saying out loud what they've been thinking all along.
Thank you. Madiba?
Thank you, Congressmember. And I want to definitely agree with everything that's been said so far and sort of tease that out a bit more. I also love, Donald, how you mentioned Abe Fortas being pressured to resign over $30-something thousand, which almost seems quaint now. Like, Clarence Thomas doesn't get out of bed for $30,000. And yet that used to be enough to get someone off of the Supreme Court. And I think there's really a variety of factors that work together to get us into this situation. As Ellie said, conservatives realized that their views were too odious to get through the democratic process, but the court is insulated, and so that gave them a better opportunity. And they had funding and the sort of network of people. They deliberately trained law students via organizations such as the Federalist Society, helped groom them for positions of power, placed them in the right positions, whether as judges or state attorneys general, and worked to basically reify this belief system. And I want to talk a little bit about this belief system as well, because it's not just that the court is doing whatever they want to do, it's that the things they want to do are terrible. And so I think a lot of where we are now is connected to the rise of originalism. Originalism is the idea that the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time, that we have to understand the Constitution today, however it was understood when it was enacted. And this is an idea that rose to prominence in the backlash to the civil rights movement. Conservative legal and political elites wanted a legal, legitimate-sounding way to say, actually, all of that hard-won progress is illegal. And, you can't actually do those things. So they realized that by freezing the meaning of the Constitution in time, you can freeze the country in time as well. And like that was the express goal, because they were opposed to having an inclusive multiracial democracy. And so I think that by developing this idea and saying that this is the one true method of interpreting the Constitution, and by indoctrinating law students with that idea, and then seeding those people in these positions of power, and then giving them all the nice luxury trips and vacations and whatnot to get them to stay in those positions of power, so they didn't feel the need to potentially retire for some other sort of lucrative job because they had a lucrative enough gig going on. All of these things, like by their powers combined, and especially as Congress was sort of abdicating some of its responsibility to do any of that regulation, you really just have a Supreme Court run amok to entrench like white capitalist supremacy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, back in 1971, when Lewis Powell, who was then a corporate lawyer, who later was appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. So in 1971, a couple of months before he was appointed to the court, he issued what's called the Lewis Powell Manifesto, which set out a blueprint for what is pretty much happening today. It's a culmination of that document, the Lewis Powell Memo. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, you might want to go and Google it. But today we have a blueprint into the future issued by the Heritage Foundation, and it's called Project 2025. And I know that many of you have heard about that document. Can anyone care to weigh in on what the current court and how it's structured and its judicial philosophy, this originalism, how does that come into play if it becomes necessary for it to rule on the legality of certain things that are promised to happen if Donald Trump gets reelected and Project 2025 gets implemented? I won't call on anyone. I'll just ask you to interject.
Okay, yeah. I've been nominated. Well, we know that we've seen the court grant immunity, right, to a president's unlawful acts, right? And we know that we elect presidents and not kings. We've seen the court overturn affirmative action, you know, after having exercised a great deal of affirmative action, right, to get the ones who are on the court now, and Roe versus Wade. And I've personally heard Justice Clarence Thomas opine that Brown versus the Board of Education should be overturned. So I think we can expect more of the same, right, to dismantle the hard-won civil rights and protections. We'll see a protection of civil rights of those who hold power, right? But we'll see the erosion of protections so that you can't teach the real history of America, and you can't protect racial or gender diversity, and we can't protect what books children read or what First Amendment rights look like on a college campus, or what voting rights look like. But the rights will continue for the powerful. And I also think that we'll see like less access to the court itself, because it won't just be the Supreme Court, it'll be the pipeline of the appellate courts and the district courts that will quash the protection of these rights.
I just want to add to that because I wrote for my magazine the section about Project 2025 and the Department of Justice. So here's some things that you should know. Project 2025, 900-page document. I've unfortunately had to read it all and then take a bath. Does not have a section on the Supreme Court. It's got a section for every other branch of government, every other cabinet level position. Doesn't have anything on the Supreme Court. Why? Because they already have it. They already have captured it, so they don't need a plan to take over the Supreme Court because they've taken over the Supreme Court. They're coming for everybody else now. So that's number one. Number two, here's how it links up with the Department of Justice section, which I think is relevant to a lot of the people in this room. Project 2025 has a complete reimagining of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, where they want to turn the Civil Rights Division into an organization that sues for the protection of racial equality and civil rights for white folks. They want to have the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division suing companies that hire black people, companies that hire women. They want them suing government programs that are like empowerment zones or have special consideration for black-owned businesses. And they're doing it under the same logic as was already elucidated by Clarence Thomas in his decision overturning affirmative action, calling the 14th Amendment colorblind. Right? Now, this is ahistorical, to say the least. Ketanji Brown Jackson, in her dissent, pointed out that the 14th Amendment was certainly not colorblind. It was absolutely concerned with the people of color who were previously enslaved by white folks. Right. But Clarence Thomas says, no, 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 the 14th Amendment has always been colorblind and race neutral. That is just a lie. But Project 2025 doubles down on that lie and imagines a world in which the white guy, the mediocre white fail son who didn't get the job or didn't get the promotion that you got because of your, merit, that is a lawsuit waiting to happen that Stephen Miller will bring and Clarence Thomas will say yes to. That is Project 2025, and that is the danger that we all face in this next election. Yeah, sorry, it was a little bit womp-womp, sad trombone, right? I'm in danger.
I want to add to that that the work of Project 2025 and the work of the Supreme Court is one and the same. These are two mutually reinforcing projects. And although the mandate for leadership in the 900 pages, they don't actually have a Supreme Court section, they do mention just a few Supreme Court cases that really demonstrate how what the Supreme Court does now is going to be their justification to do even worse things next. So, for example, they name check Dobbs, saying that, oh, well, because in light of Dobbs, now we can enforce the Comstock Act. Which would basically implement overnight, without even any more congressional action, a nationwide abortion ban. It would also limit access to birth control, and basically whatever fits under the umbrella of obscene, which I feel like is an extraordinarily broad term, and like anything could count as obscene. So Congress would be able to attack that. They also say because of Dobbs, they have the right to stop pregnant children in immigration detention from getting abortion access, saying that pregnant children have to have children of their own. So those are the kinds of things they say, because of the Supreme Court, this is what we can do next. They also name check CELA, a 2020 decision about the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. In that decision, the court was like, the leadership structure of the agency is unconstitutional. And so in Project 2025, they're like, let's take that further. The whole agency is unconstitutional. And we need to call into question whether independent agencies can exist at all. So again, they got an inch from the court, and now they're taking the mile. And similarly, it is, what was that third decision? I mean, Chevron, thank you. They're just going to go ham over Chevron. Well, like no longer having the way that Chevron would say, if there's some ambiguity or some confusion over how to construct what a statute means, defer to the agency that's charged with applying that statute, the one that Congress entrusted with that task. Now it's just left to the courts. And one of the really egregious ones, I mean, it's all egregious, but this one, it just struck me as particularly insidious. They cite Students for Fair Admissions, the case that struck down affirmative action, to say that the Environmental Protection Agency, of all things, can't consider racial impact in like where like companies go, like where they're cited and like which communities are dealing with the consequences of pollution. And there's already been cases to this effect. Like 3 weeks ago, a Trump-appointed district court judge in Louisiana said that, you know, even though there are hundreds of like petrochemical corporations in black neighborhoods in Louisiana, and even though there are elevated rates of all sorts of illnesses in those areas as a result, so much so that the residents refer to it as Cancer Alley, they say the court said that the EPA isn't allowed to consider that. They're not allowed to consider the racially disproportionate impact because that wouldn't be neutral. It would be the actual racist thing to do was to think about race. So that's the kind of logic that they put forth, that the Supreme Court put forth in Students for Fair Admission. And now we're already seeing some Trump-appointed judges run with that, and we're seeing that in Project 2025, they plan to take that even further. So I think that's one thing. The Supreme Court did some nonsense, and now Project 25 is like, thank you very much. Here is additional nonsense that we can do as a result. And I think another thing to be aware of as well is that Project 25 is an extremely detailed plan, right? It's 900 pages that I mercifully did not read all of. I just hit Control F on court to see what they had to say. But still, the point is that it's extraordinarily detailed. And I think that when the Trump administration was in office the first time, they didn't have all their plans worked out. And their plans, in fact, were sometimes executed so poorly that it took them a couple tries to get the court to approve it. Because the court would be like, I can't actually sign off on that with a straight face. Please clean it up a little bit and come back to me, and then I'll sign off on it.
We want a better Muslim ban.
Right, precisely. Yeah. They said, that Muslim ban is too embarrassing. Can you give me a better Muslim ban? And because we will happily sign off on that. And so I think that now, though, with Project 2025, this is the plan. This is them doing the preparation so they are enabled to do successfully the first try what it took them second or third or fourth tries to do before. So I think that we would no longer have the court striking down some of the excesses of a Trump administration as it occasionally did before, just because the administration is better prepared now. Project 2025 will allow it to execute its plans more and have the Supreme Court sign off on them more readily.
So what does it really look like if we have a Republican President, Trump, and the possibility of a Republican Senate and Republican House, this coming upon us in just 4 short months? What does that look like, Donald?
Well, this is the part where I say that CREW is a nonpartisan organization. But I would say this. I think it is obvious from the only term that Donald Trump has served in office that a single president, particularly unchecked by the judiciary, can do an extraordinary amount of damage to our institutions of government. That threat has been enabled significantly by the 6 right-wing justices that, as my colleague Madiba said, were groomed precisely for that role. And I think it's important to remember that one of the reasons why the Trump administration had to go through multiple rounds in his first term is because, except for the last 3 months, there was a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court. And so the idea of what a immune from prosecution, right, corrupt, newly re-empowered president can do with a 6-3 majority on the court that has demonstrated over the last several years that they want to give more power to the executive, when it suits them, of course, that they will deny originalism. This is the part where I say that my team represented the Colorado voters that brought the ballot challenge case against Trump earlier this year, which was rooted in originalism and dismissed out of hand. And so I think these justices choose originalism when it suits them and ignore originalism when it doesn't suit them. Right. But I think the situation that the possibility of a corrupt and immune president with a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court and a playbook for, in Project 2025, to not just expand his authority, but have the cosign of the High Court is deeply concerning. It's deeply concerning for institutional reasons. As we have said, we don't have a king. But if we have a president that is immune from prosecution and a court that will rubber stamp everything that, every abuse that is committed, and a well-documented playbook for how to abuse that authority, yeah, I would be concerned. And I think that is what, that is certainly one possible future. And I think we are preparing for all possibilities because, and this gets back to the earlier point, whether or not Donald Trump is in the White House in the next Congress, it's incumbent upon Congress to use its power to shore up our institutions. One of the reasons we got here is because Congress did nothing on ethics abuses from the executive branch, from the courts, until the world was on fire, right? It's Chairman Johnson and other members who are shouting off the rooftops saying we need to do something, and then Donald Trump becomes president, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, all of a sudden all these reports come out about Clarence Thomas and Harlan Crow, and everybody's like, oh, maybe that Johnson guy had was on the right track, right? Like, whatever happens in this election, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to shore up our institutions, to make sure that this kind of rampant corruption and capture of our highest court never happens again.
So I just want to add one thing, Congressman Johnson, to that. We are nonpartisan as well, of course, but the 2025 playbook also says that the DOJ will no longer seek and will release consent decrees. And what that means is the ACLU has sued police departments for their abuse of power and their excessive use of force to murder Black and brown people, right? And the Department of Justice heretofore in the Civil Rights Division has gone in and said, we'll agree, we need a consent decree, right? We'll monitor you. We need you to do these things. We need you to, get these officers to stop using force, to stop killing Black people, in essence. So that would go away. That protection on the streets would go away. The Department of Justice would be weaponized in the opposite direction. And we know that we've heard the Republican nominee for the presidency say that police should get absolute immunity, that you don't hold their head when you put them in the car, right? We know what that means. So on the streets, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, and the Project 2025 calls for the FBI director to be neutered and subject, or he would have to report directly to the president. So the president would have a FBI to do the work that he would want to do. But, that's a worst case scenario. It can definitely happen. But if it does not happen, and Congress is under the control of Democrats next year, House and Senate, one House or the other, and a Democratic president, things will look much better. I have proposed some legislation that can fix this issue with the United States Supreme Court. First, a bill to expand the court, actually add 4 seats to the court so that it can be rebalanced. And then secondly, legislation that would impose term limits on Supreme Court justices, would limit them to one 18-year term, and thereafter they would come off of the bench and become senior justices. And then last but not least, legislation that would impose a code of conduct on the Supreme Court. And there have been those who would say that such legislation disrupts the delicate system of checks and balances, it's unconstitutional, or it's just political. Can any of the panelists respond to the legislation and its criticism and why that criticism is incorrect?
I mean, I just have to laugh. I think it is comically so clearly constitutional. It's kind of ridiculous to assert otherwise. Congress literally has the power stated in the Constitution to enact laws that are necessary and proper to further its goals. And it seems necessary and proper to me to have a Supreme Court that has a ethical standard. Also, Congress has already enacted an oath that the justices swear to when they ascend to the high court, an oath that lower court judges also take. And a code of conduct basically seems like an advanced oath to me, and so I don't see how you would have the power to do one and not the other. I think it just doesn't make sense. So I'm like, this is laughable. This is foolish. I think you would maybe depending on how you did it, there could have been an argument about term limits. But if you're constructing it in a way where you do still have your judicial office, you just become a senior judge instead of like a regular sitting judge, that also seems like a non-issue to me. And expanding the court, also very obviously constitutional, something that has happened repeatedly throughout history. So I just feel like there's not really a legitimate basis to say that these things are don't have a legal foundation. And as far as destabilizing checks and balances goes, I would say look around. Do things seem either checked or balanced to you? Because they do not to me. And I think and if we do have a system of checks and balances, then it is time to do some of that checking. And so Congress has power and should use it.
Madiba is absolutely right on the constitution of it all. Let me talk a little bit about the politics of it all. All right, term limits, extremely popular, polls nearly 70%. We are the only nation in the world that does not have term limits on our high court justices. So I think it's great for America to maybe enter, if not the 21st century, at least the 20th century, and put some term limits on these impossibly powerful people, right? Ethics reform, another idea that polls around 70%. People like ethics. They don't like corruption. This is simple stuff politically. Court expansion. All right, that's the one that polls a little, that's the one that's still below water. That's the one that's a little bit harder to do. But let me try to explain why court expansion is politically necessary to get the other things that we want. Because while I totally agree with Madiba that term limits and ethics reform is constitutional, I ain't on the Supreme Court. You don't got to convince me. You have to convince the justices already on the Supreme Court that they can, for instance, be term limited out. The bill for term limits says that they are term limited out after 18 years of service. Guess which justices have served for more than 18 years? Clarence Thomas, John Roberts, and Sam Alito. So you got to convince them that it's time for them to get the hell gone. And how are you going to do that? Well, That's why court expansion becomes so very important. Right? The analogy that I've made in the past is that if you ever watch like a nature documentary, you ever watch like National Geographic, you'll see there's like a park ranger, right? He's out in the Botswana and he's got the hat and he's like, we're going to put this radio tracking collar on this elephant so we can figure out what the elephant is doing, right? What do they do first? Does my brother just roll up on the elephant with a collar and like hop up? No. You tranquilize the elephants. Then you put the collar on, then you have all your science, right? You do that the wrong way, you're gonna get a trunk up in places you don't want a trunk, right? So you gotta trank the elephant first, then put the collar on. Same thing with the court. Court expansion tranquilizes the extremist Republicans currently on the court and puts them to sleep long enough to get the amazingly popular political reforms of ethics reforms and term limits. But you got to trank it first, and that's what court expansion does. So when you ask, like, do I want more justices? Yeah. And the only political litmus test I have for court expansion is not, do you agree with me on tax policy? It's actually not even, do you agree with me on reproductive rights? I will point 4 justices. I don't care where they stand on many of the hot-button political issues. The only question I would have for the next 4 justices is, do you think the Supreme Court should have less power? Do you think the American people should get to decide the laws and rights and responsibilities we live under, or do you think 9 unelected, unaccountable justices should get to decide? If you agree that the Supreme Court should have less power, come on down. You're on the Supreme Court now. That's the litmus test for court expansion so that we can have the necessary reforms that the public overwhelmingly wants for this institution.
So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached, we've got about 10 minutes to go. I'd ask if any member of the audience has any questions that they would like to ask. If you would, we have a microphone right here. Let's start up at the top with this gentleman right here.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, each of you, for your time. My name is Oliver Toulousma. My background is in law, but now I'm working in policy. I have a question because last week I had the opportunity to watch Justice Jackson give a talk in regards to her book, and she made a note to draw a clear distinction between political partisanship and judicial philosophy. But in each of your opinions, does that really matter when you're having a conversation, say, on the street? Do you feel like people believe that there is a fine line between judicial philosophy and political partisanship?
I don't think the justices believe there's a fine line between judicial philosophy and political partisanship. I think they're aware. They pretend otherwise sometimes for propriety's sake, but I think it's very, very clear. Like when you are an originalist, it is in order to achieve conservative results. And I think occasionally you see folks try to use originalism to have more progressive results. I think Justice Jackson does that excellently. But I think it still also doesn't get you the kind of progressive results you need and would have if you were doing something other than originalism. So no, I think I find it pretty transparent, and I think it's transparent to the justices as well. They just feel like they can't say that.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. First of all, no. Second of all, they change their philosophy when it suits them. And third of all, it doesn't matter to real people, right? Like if somebody's taking away your rights, who cares whether it's because of originalism or some other philosophy, right? The impact on people, especially our folks, is the same, whatever philosophy they want to dress it up as.
Okay, young lady right over there. Okay, hold on till you get the microphone.
Hello. Continuing on that point, how do we get unstuck from originalism? Because that's what it sounds like based on what you've described. And then with the expanding of the court, not very original for most people. How do we merge those two ideas? And then second question, what is the congressional appetite for expanding the court?
Yeah, it is mild at this time, but it's growing. People are getting hungrier. And, you know, as evidenced by the number of people in this room today, when you go back 2 years when we first started doing this, you know, just a handful of people, and now in this room, I don't know how many people were here at the height of the discussion, but even the President, Biden, acknowledges that we need to do court reform. And so anytime the president is behind it, and I think the future president will be behind it, I think the congressional, and if the people are behind it, I think the congressional appetite becomes more ravenous and we can start to get things done.
I'll just add on the appetite. When I first started writing about court reform, well, the first thing I ever wrote about court expansion was after Bush v. Gore, and I was still in law school, and I got laughed out of class, laughed out of my little school paper. Like, you can't publish that? Are you kidding me?
That was Harvard,
right? That was Harvard. That was Harvard Law School. They're just like, are you? Maybe you should have gone to Yale. Like, they were not. There was no chill about that, right? But the first kind of professional thing that I wrote about it was during the Merrick Garland fiasco during the Obama term. And for my publication, I couldn't find a poll. That question was not even being polled, so I couldn't even tell you how low the appetite was for court expansion just back in 2016. The first poll I did see was in 2017 and was something like 15%. Now we're at 42%, which doesn't sound a lot, but from my perspective, we're coming out, right? So, like, never underestimate the importance of leadership on this issues. Yeah, we're not there yet in terms of having a critical number of congressmen and senators who are willing to go for court expansion. But we have come so far so fast. If we keep pushing the rock, we will get there, in part because, excuse my language, the Supreme Court keeps showing its jaws. Right? The Supreme Court isn't going to stop doing these extremist, ridiculous positions coming out of the gate. They come back to work next month. The first thing they're going to do is legalize ghost guns. We've got the EMTALA case that's like the Supreme Court is going to keep doing extremist, ridiculous things. And every time they do, we get more people interested in court expansion.
Up here, this gentleman.
Hello. Hi, my name is Jovan Davis. I work for Common Cause. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager. Question. I have this conversation about court expansion. What are your theories? I'm not a big fan of it. I would rather vote for justices. I think I'm fearful that setting a precedent of expanding the court would give the opposing party the same idea, and we just continue to do something like that over and over. Not completely realistic, but I'm curious. Instead of voting for our justices, I'm in Georgia, so we vote on our Supreme Court justices. We vote on several justices. The argument of that versus expanding the court. Do you think there's more labor behind that? What are your thoughts?
This is mine. All right. So first of all, I get this question all the time. Well, if the Democrats expand the court, then Republicans will expand the court. So what? So what if Republicans win the trifecta, come back and re-expand over, right? We are right now down 6-3. If the Democrats add justices and the Republicans add justices, and sometime in the future we're down 16-13, what does that matter? All that's happened is that maybe I've gotten a couple of years where I have a sympathetic Supreme Court, at which point I can pass voting rights legislation and term limits and ethics reform. And that makes it very, very hard for the Republicans to ever win the trifecta again if we just have everybody vote and have those votes counted, right? So even if in a world in which the Republicans, and it's just an endless tit for tat, even in that world, I still come out better, number one. Number two, the idea of having a significantly more expanded Supreme Court also helps me, because at the point where right now we've got 9 justices, right? That means you only need 5 justices to make a decision. Well, think about it this way. If you're going out with your boys after work, right, and you only have to convince 4 of your boys to go someplace, you might go to some places, right? You might go to some places that you ain't supposed to go, right? It's just you and your friends, right? But now imagine the court is, let's say, 29 people as opposed to 9. Now you got to convince 15 people to get onto a majority decision. What happens to that majority decision? It becomes less extreme. It becomes more and more moderate because of the law of large numbers. It's harder and harder to get a majority. So to continue the analogy, if you've got to get 15 people to go out at your family reunion to dinner, where are you going to go? You're going to go to Applebee's. You're going to go to the Olive Garden. You're going to go to some anodyne center mass place, right? So more and more justices means those decisions get less and less extreme. My final point on this, if we end up in a world where every new presidential administration has to add a certain number of Supreme Court justices so their agenda can be upheld as lawful, well, dang it, that just sounds like democracy to me. I would rather be in a situation where you had 100 Supreme Court justices and you had to add enough to get your legislation passed, because it still then comes down to the will of the voters to figure out what is lawful and what is not, as opposed to the Supreme Court. Remember, the idea that the Supreme Court can call something unconstitutional is unique, again, on the world stage. That's not how they do it in Germany. That's not how they do it in South Africa, right? It's unique, and it's anti-democratic fundamentally. The Constitution does not say the Supreme Court can get rid of laws of Congress. The Supreme Court gave that power to themselves. We should take it away.
I like that. Although I would say that my 15 relatives would vote for Golden Corral. But listen, we have a lot of questions out there that I wish that we could get to, but we only have an hour in this room, and so it is time for us to depart. I want to thank you all for coming and for your interest in this very important subject, and I want to thank the panelists for their contribution to this discussion. And last but not least, before I thank my wife for allowing us to have this, I want to thank my staff for all of the great work that they've done to produce this. And of course, my lovely wife, Marita Davis Johnson, is in the house, always supportive of everything that I do. So thank you all so much, and let's go.